Hello, we are back with our story of The Lost Horizon by James Hilton. And we were reading about these old friends and comrades talking about one of them. And we stopped at the point where the man was about to read the manuscript of what they had discussed about the mystery. So it ended with, I took the manuscript away with me and read it on the train to Ostend, chapter 1. That's where we stopped. Now I continue with the chapter 1. During the third week in May, the fighting in Basul had become much worse, and aeroplanes arrived on the 20th to take Europeans to Peshawar. Most of them were carried across the mountains in big Air Force machines, but a few smaller planes were also used, including a machine lent by the Maharaja of Chandapur. 4 passengers set off in this: Miss Roberta Brinklow, Henry D. Barnard, an American citizen, Hugh Conway, British consul, and Captain Charles Mallinson, British Vice Consul. Conway was 37. He had been at Basul for 2 years, and now, after a few months' holiday in England, he would be sent somewhere else. He was a tall and sunburnt man with short brown hair and grey-blue eyes. His eyes now looked very tired. He had been working day and night for the last 24 hours, and he was thankful to get away. He sat back in his seat and closed his eyes as the plane set off, glad that he was not traveling in one of the crowded Air Force machines. When they had been flying for more than an hour, Mallinson suddenly said he thought the pilot wasn't going in the right direction. Mallinson sat just in front of Conway. He was a young man to his mid-20s, and during the flight, he had once or twice spoken to Conway. But Conway did not want to talk. So now he just opened his eyes sleepily and replied that the pilot must know what he was doing. Half an hour later, Mallinson spoke again. I say, Conway, I thought Fenner was piloting us. Well, isn't he? Asked Conway sleepily. 1 second. Sorry, my eye was itching a little. Well, isn't he? Asked Conway sleepily. The man turned his head just now, and I'm sure it wasn't Fenner. Well, then it must be someone else. I don't see that it matters. But who is this man? My dear boy, how should I know? Said Conway. You don't suppose that I can remember the face of every man in the Air Force, do you? I know most of them, but I don't recognize this fellow, Mallinson insisted. Then he must be one of the few whom you don't know, Conway smiled and added, when we arrive in Peshawar, you can ask him all about himself. At this rate, we shan't get to Peshawar at all. I'm sure the man has lost his way, said Mallinson. Just at that moment, the plane began to descend. My God, Mallinson cried, looking through the window. Look down there. Conway looked. The view was certainly not what he had expected. Instead of neat lines of houses, nothing could be seen except a huge sun-browned desert with rocky, treeless mountains in the distance. It was not at all like the country near Peshawar. I don't recognize this part of the world, Conway said, and added quietly to Mallinson, it looks as if you're right, the man must have lost his way. The plane was going down at a great speed, and the air grew hotter. The machine bumped and shook, and all 4 passengers had to hold on to their seats. It looks as if he wants to land, shouted the American. He can't, Mallinson answered. He would be mad to try. He'll crash and then... But the pilot did land. He skillfully brought the plane down in a small, cleared space by the side of a little valley. At once, a crowd of bearded and turbaned tribesmen came forward from all directions, surrounding the machine and preventing anyone except the pilot from getting out. The pilot climbed out and began talking to them excitedly, and Conway soon realized that the man was certainly not Fenner. In fact, he was not an Englishman at all, and possibly not even a European. Meanwhile, cans of petrol were brought and emptied into the tanks of the machine. No one took any notice of the shouts of the 4 imprisoned passengers. When the tanks were at last filled, a can of water was passed through one of the windows of the plane. No questions were answered, although the tribesmen did not seem unfriendly. Then the pilot climbed back into the cockpit and set off once more. The plane rose high into the sky and then turned east. It was mid-afternoon. The direction could be guessed from the sun. East all the time, with occasional turns to the north, but Conway could not guess where they were going. He closed his eyes but did not sleep as he thought over the problem. They were all in a very awkward situation, it seemed to him, and he felt particularly anxious about their woman passenger. It seemed fairly certain that they were being kidnapped for ransom. The whole affair had evidently been very carefully planned, so they would probably be quite well treated, but they might have to suffer a good deal of discomfort before their ransom money arrived. Meanwhile, he realized that his companions might have many personal reasons for anxiety. Mallinson particularly seemed anxious and excited. As the hours passed, the young man became more and more restless, and he seemed to be annoyed by Conway's calmness. "Look here," he shouted at last. "Must we sit here doing nothing while this madman takes us wherever he wants to go? Why don't we break the window and take him prisoner?" "He has a gun and we haven't," said Conway, "and none of us would know how to bring the machine to earth afterwards." "It can't be very difficult. I am sure you could do it." "My dear Mallinson, why do you always expect me to perform these wonders?" said Conway, beginning to feel annoyed with the young man. "Well, anyway, can't we make the fellow come down?" Mallinson went on. He was growing more and more excited. "How do you suggest we do it?" Conway asked coldly. "Well, he's there, isn't he? Do we have to sit and look at his back all the time? At least we might force him to tell us what his game is." "Very well, we'll see," said Conway. There was a small window between the cabin and the cockpit, through which the pilot could speak to the passengers. Conway went forward and knocked on the glass. The reply was exactly what he had expected. The man turned and pointed a gun straight at Conway. He did not speak a word, and Conway returned to his seat without argument. Mallinson, who had watched the incident, was only partly satisfied. I don't suppose he would have dared to shoot, he said. Probably not, agreed Conway. But I would rather leave you to make sure of that. He offered Mallinson a cigarette. I know how you feel, he said gently, but we really can't do anything at the moment. There was nothing else to do. So he leaned back in the chair and went to sleep. When he awoke, he noticed that the others had also gone to sleep. He turned to the window and looked out. The sky was clear now, and in the afternoon light he saw a sight whose beauty left him breathless. Far away at the very limit of the distance lay a long line of snow-covered mountains, which seemed to be floating in the clouds. They stood like a great white wall, which seemed to be part of the sky itself, until the sun's rays caught them and turned them into flaming brightness. Conway sat quietly, trying to puzzle out where they were. He thought of maps, calculated distances, and worked out times and speeds. Then he realized that the others had awakened also and were looking at him expectantly. Chapter 2. Conway pointed out of the window at the shining wall of mountains, and the others noticed that looked at it for a long moment. And the others looked at it for a long moment, speechless with amazement. At last, Bernard, the American, turned to Conway and asked him if he knew where they were. I think we are still in India, said Conway. He explained that they had been flying east for several hours. They were flying too high to see much, but they were probably following the course of some river valley. It may be the upper Indus, he said. Do you recognize where we are then? Bernard asked. No, I have never been anywhere near here before. But I won't be surprised if that mountain is Nanga Parbat, Conway answered, pointing out of the window. It looks to me as if we are going straight towards that line of mountains over there, said Bernard. Do you know what they are? I think they must be the Karakorams, said Conway. There are several ways across if our man wants to go that way. Our man, said Mallinson. Our madman, you mean? Would anyone except a madman fly into this kind of country? I know that no one except a very fine airman could, said Bernard. I understand that these are the highest mountains in the world. Yes, you must admit that it was well-organized madness, Mallinson, said Conway. And then he suddenly felt that he did not want to continue the argument. The whole situation was dangerous, no doubt, but there seemed no point at the moment in discussing possibilities. They were quite powerless to do anything. He turned once more and looked out of the window. The sun was setting now, and the deep purple from the valleys spread upwards to the mountain tops. And suddenly the whole range grew pale with a fresh splendor as a full moon rose. As a full moon rose. It touched each mountain top like some heavenly lamplighter until the long horizon shone like silver against a blue-black sky. The air grew colder and a wind sprang up, shaking the machine uncomfortably. The new discomforts added to the mystery of the passengers, but Conway felt sure that they would land soon. The supply of petrol could not last forever. Miss Brinklow suddenly turned and spoke to Conway. Do you know, she said, shouting above the noise of the plane. This is my first trip in the air. A friend of mine tried to persuade me once to fly from London to Paris, but I refused to do it. And now you are flying from India to Tibet instead, said Bernard. And Miss Brinklow smiled and nodded her head cheerfully. Conway began to think that Miss Brinklow's common sense and calm acceptance of the position might prove very valuable in the future. He smiled at her approvingly and then closed his eyes again and went quite easily and peacefully to sleep. And the aeroplane flew on. Suddenly, they were all wakened by a violent movement of the machine. Conway's head hit the window, and a moment later, he fell between the two rows of seats as the plane tipped to the other side. His ears were full of a strange sound, and he realized that the engine had been shut off and the plane was flying against a strong wind. He looked through the window and saw the earth quite close beneath him. He's going to land, Mallinson shouted, and Bernard, who had been thrown out of his seat, added sourly, if he's lucky. Miss Brinklow seemed the least disturbed of them all. And was straightening her hair as calmly as if Dover Harbor were just in sight. Presently, the plane touched ground, but it was a bad landing. The passengers were thrown from side to side. Something was heard to strain and break, and one of the tires burst. Mallinson pulled open the door of the cabin and prepared to jump to earth. Careful, Conway shouted, but the youth answered, there's no need to be careful. This looks like the end of the world. There's no one to be seen anywhere. A moment later, they all realized that this was true. Trembling a little with cold and shock, they climbed out of the machine and found themselves in the middle of a great treeless plain which was swept by a fierce wind. The moon had disappeared behind clouds, but the mountains on the far horizon shone in the starlight like a row of dog's teeth. Mallinson moved toward the front of the plane and climbed up to the cockpit. After a few seconds, however, he dropped down again, gripped Conway's arm, and said in a low voice, I say, Conway, it is strange. I think the fellow is dead or something. Come up and look. Conway climbed up stiffly and looked into the cockpit. The pilot was leaning forward, white and motionless, with his head on his hands. Conway shook him and loosened the clothes around his neck. Then he turned round to report, yes, something has happened. We must get him out. With Bernard and Mallinson helping him, Conway lifted the pilot from his seat and carried him to the ground. He was unconscious but not dead. Possibly he has had a heart attack caused by the great height, Conway suggested, bending over the unknown man. We can't do anything for him out here. There is no shelter from this frightful wind. We must get him inside the cabin. They carried the man into the cabin and laid him on the floor between the seats. Conway examined him while Bernard struck one match after another in order to give him a little light. After an interval, Conway saw the man's eyelids move very slightly. Mallinson suddenly began to laugh wildly. I can't help it, he cried. We all look such fools striking matches over a dead body. He isn't a beauty, is he? A Chinaman, I should say. Possibly, said Conway sharply, but he is not a dead body yet. With a bit of luck, he may recover. He realized that the situation had ceased to be excitingly dangerous and was threatening to become a trial of endurance which might end in death for them all. The pilot was the only one who could give them details of their position, although Conway guessed that they had flown far beyond the western range of the Himalayas and must now be on the highest part of the Earth's surface, the Tibetan plateau. This great unexpected upland was 2 miles high, even in its lowest valleys, and it was swept continually by icy winds. Looking out of the window, Conway could see the outline of a long valley with rounded hills on either side, standing like black shadows against the deep blue of the night sky. And at the head of the valley, rising high into the gap, appeared what he thought must be the loveliest mountains on earth. But although the mountain was so beautiful, its snow-covered perfection increased the feeling of loneliness and danger. Time पर है. The nearest human settlement was probably hundreds of miles away. They had no food, the aeroplane was damaged, and they had no clothes suited to the terrible winds. Yes, their only hope seemed to be the pilot. The man was breathing more strongly now and sometimes moved slightly. Probably Mallinson was right in guessing the man to be Chinese. He had the typical flat nose and high cheekbones. We stop here. This is on page 22 and we'll continue next time. I hope you are finding it interesting because there's quite a long bit to be continued. Thank you.
Can you explain?
The plane flew away. Then they realized that it was not one of their team. It was a stranger who was flying the plane. And then it went somewhere, they didn't know what course it was on, and they didn't know which land it was on. Ultimately, he came down from a great height, down where they could see the valley far below, and the beautiful mountain at the end of the valley. And the pilot came and landed, a very hard landing, very bad landing. The tire burst and they all were hit against the sides and all that. The plane stopped. And then they looked, the pilot had fainted. So somebody said, oh, he's dead. Somebody said, no, he's not dead, he's still alive. So one man struck matches to see, and the other man was examining that guy. Then after some thing and all, the man, his eyes moved. So he had not died. That's where we are.